So I understand you teach courses on environmental sciences, and you do research on climate change at University at Albany. Now, every guest that we've had on this show is unique, of course, but the way you integrate geochemistry and the arts currently sets you apart in many ways. So let's look at some images of the work that you do on the research side, as well as some of the artist collaborations that you've done. These photographs of your work are just incredible. Sujata, maybe give us a nutshell version of what it is you investigate.
Absolutely. So I use corals from coral reefs and models to tell me about past changes in climate over the past maybe 200 to 500 years. And so the idea is that in the last few decades, we have a lot of information about our environmental systems because we have satellites that are collecting all of this data for us. But as we go farther back in time, we don't really know what's happened because we don't have that many observations. And so,
I mean, satellites weren't sent out thousands of years ago, right?
Exactly. Satellites only started in the 1980s getting launched up into space.
Right.
And so we have a lot of tools we can use to look at past changes in climate, and I use corals as my tool. And the idea is that if we understand the past, we can better predict and anticipate the future, conditions we might be living in as we think about climate change and global warming.
So describe that a bit. I mean, what exactly do you look at in the corals? Like, are you cutting them up? How do you do this?
Yeah, so we take a underwater drill and we drill a core into the coral. All the way through, from the top to bottom, so that we can take little tiny samples and measure the chemistry of the coral. Okay. The chemistry essentially changes as climate changes. And so we can use it as a way to tell us about climate change over the entire lifespan of the coral.
So it's kind of like studying the rings of a tree. If you're doing a cross-section of a trunk of a tree and you've got the rings, and that can tell you about different climate changes and water and soil and all that stuff.
Exactly. Corals are actually a lot like tree rings. They also grow these annual bands. So, in tree rings, you count one ring or 1 year after another back through time. And we can do that with corals. So if we take a sample from the middle of the coral, we know what date it represents. And we can therefore take that chemistry, convert it to climate, and say this was the climate in this year, in this month, and construct a whole multi-century record of that change.
That's incredible. Now, tell me a bit about you, Sujata, because I know you used to want to be an opera singer at one point. That was one of your major goals.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I wanted to be an opera singer. Music has been a part of my life since I was very young. I started playing piano when I was 5, trumpet, in middle school and high school. And
so you're like a Renaissance woman.
A bit, I guess. I've never thought of myself that way. But I've loved music, and it eventually transitioned into vocal performance and wanting to be an opera singer in high school. I think for me, growing up, music and art was always a way for me to express myself and a way to kind of communicate and connect with people. I went to the Interlochen Arts Academy in high school, and one of their big beliefs is this idea of communicating and bringing people together through the universal language of the arts.
Right.
And I think as a scientist, I still very much think about that and adopt that mentality in trying to, join up with artists and art communities so I can communicate my science and inspire and connect with communities who might not otherwise want to hear about what I do.
Yeah, well, this is so interesting that you're using art as a kind of vehicle for sort of a public display or a public sharing, if you will, of your research. Tell us a bit about how that's played out for you in the past. I know you're also working on some projects now, which we'll get to, but how have you, what's an example of the ways in which art can motivate people to understand and also act on the issue of climate change?
I've been involved in collaborations in the past, one of which was at the McMullen Museum of Art, which is part of Boston College. And there, they were running a full museum exhibition, which was bringing together 6 artists who are from Indian Ocean rim countries, for them to kind of display art and share art that was part of their perspective about, what the Indian Ocean is today and, how it's changing with climate. And so, to complement that, I contributed as a scientist, kind of providing this background information about what is climate in the Indian Ocean today, what does it look like, as a kind of context for the artwork that was being presented. So, part of that exhibit, we had these animations kind of rotating right next next to the beginning of the exhibition. And when we were there for the patrons opening, we would see these patrons actually sitting for 5-10 minutes at a time.
Oh, wow. So they were really engrossed in the work that they were seeing.
Absolutely. Just staring at it and talking with each other about how cool it was. And they didn't know what the Indian Ocean was like in terms of its climate. And then they went with that understanding and appreciated and learned about the art. And that connection was so inspiring for me.
And isn't there a project that you're working on now too? It's called Synergy 2, if I'm right about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us about that a bit. I understand you worked with a photographer on that project.
Yeah, so I worked with an artist, a composite photographer. Her name is Marcy Cohen. She's from New York. We are working as part of this project called Synergy 2. And that is a collaboration between the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, where I was before I moved here, and the Art League of Rhode Island. And so the idea is that they wanted to pair up scientists and artists together. So Marcy is my artist partner. And together we're supposed to find a way to communicate the science that we do to the broader public, but also to inspire and to teach people about the world's oceans, in a more general sense, so that people are engaged with oceanography.
Right. I mean, I understand, too, that I'm seeing these images. They're really, really compelling and really beautiful. It's so interesting to see how now you're making things like science and scientific research really accessible to people in a way that maybe people wouldn't necessarily expect, right?
And that's one of my goals, that's one of my passions. How do we reach new people?
Yeah. I'm thinking about the research that you've done internationally as well, and not just, underwater, but I understand you've also interacted with communities who live along the coastal parts of the Indian Ocean. Can you tell us a story from the time that you did this research and what you learned from interacting with these communities and these people who live there?
Yeah, I have one memory in particular that's stuck with me and motivated me for a long time. The first time I ever did field work, I was in the Pacific Ocean, and we were trying to get corals from Micronesia, which is this chain of tiny, tiny little islands in the Pacific Ocean that are super flat and low-lying islands, so barely above the sea level, so the top of the ocean. We would have to live on a boat and go to these islands and ask permission from the chief in order to be able to collect our samples.
Right.
And when we finished our field work, we would go back and we would, show the chief and the community what we did with photos, and we'd talk about the science and talk about, why we were doing the science that we were doing and why it was important.
Right, and the kind of role, too, that they're playing in helping you do the research you need to do.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think they really care about their role. And so the chief of an island, one of the islands, he asked the chief scientist on our cruise, what can we do to help? How do we stop climate change? How do we stop sea level rise? Because our island is going to be underwater soon. It's just devastating. What do you say to that, to an island community that's so small and is not the problem? They are not contributing.
So they're not a major contributor to a lot of climate change. I mean, who are the major contributors?
I think the United States, Europe, the UK, China, we have some kind of big players in terms of who's emitting enormous amounts of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere and creating this problem of accelerated warming.
Right. So relatively wealthier countries have been industrialized for a really long time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is very timely that we're having this conversation, Sujata, because I understand the United States government is actually getting involved, participating in a global climate change summit that's taking place this coming November, and I think it's located in Scotland. Now, the Biden administration has claimed that the U.S. should really be leading the fight against climate change, I think partially in acknowledgement of the fact that the U.S. has actually been a major contributor to climate change. But what would you say about that? What are some suggestions and some recommendations that you would have for world leaders who want to take reasonable steps toward fighting climate change, but also, for preparing people in general all across the world, as well as in the U.S., for a warming planet?
Yeah, and it's a big question, right? And it's an important one. And, at the end of the day, we need to cut back our emissions of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. It is extremely clear that at the level of emissions that we're currently putting out into the atmosphere, it's just that it's creating such a problem in terms of warming. And I think when they come together and all of these countries are thinking about what can we do, that needs to be made a priority. Thinking about the transition from fossil fuels to green energies, for example. Exactly what that looks like is going to change for different countries around the world.
But green energies could look like wind power, solar power.
Exactly, wave energy, tidal energy, geothermal. There's a whole suite of options available to us to start thinking about and really improving in terms of their efficiency and technology. I think focusing on that is important. But like you said, we also have to think about, how societies are responding to what's already happening and what is going to continue happening.
Right.
And I think one example is sea level rise. Coastal societies around the world are going to feel those impacts and have already started feeling those impacts. And so how do we help prepare them and mitigate the damage and the costliness of the
rising sea levels and this
Exactly.
climate change. Yeah. Well, Sujata, it sounds like the work you're doing, these art-science collaborations, are really sending out an important message to people, and it has a major, major impact. So thank you so much for being on House for Arts.
Thank you so much for having me.